Hello, I'm Dara Thomason of Stitch Quilting Co. Welcome to our last week of our Learn to Quilt charity quilt along. This whole series has been so much fun to work on in teaching you the very basic steps of how to develop a quilt. We've gone through selecting fabric, reading a pattern, cutting out our pattern, piecing, pressing, putting the pieces together, and now we have a finished product. Now, you might notice this is not the 9 patch that we have been working on. This is actually a charity quilt that I made for my son's basketball coach from last year. So all of the pattern that we've been working on for the last 7 weeks has been this beautiful 9 patch. But I have quilted all my 9 patches, and so I need to show you how to put on a binding, prepare a binding first of all, put a binding on, and then we're going to do the label. So I decided my son's basketball coach from last year has continued to meet with him over the summer and in the autumn, and he won't take any money. And he actually sold his car so he could go to university. So we go to his house, pick him up, and we take him to the church. We have a key to the church. So he's been doing that, and so this is a really wonderful way to show appreciation. And I'm totally in love with this panel and the fabrics that go with it, so I'm just, like, shamelessly plugging this fabric. It's from Dina Reuter. She's an incredible artist and designer for Riley Blake, and so these are amazing panels. I didn't realize how big they are, but they're incredible. So all you need to do is use our basting tools from week 5 and use our free motion quilting skills from week 6, and you'll have a quick present. In fact, I was able to quilt this one up very quickly, and so I'm going to be showing you how to trim off the outside part and then prepare and put on the binding. So we are almost done. Hear how soft and cuddly this quilt's going to be. When I quilted it, this is actually a design from my Inspired by Nature course that you can find on Riley Blake. It is called Hoodoos. So, all right, we're gonna go over to my cutting table, and when we do, you're going to need your cute cuts, your 10.5 inch trim it ruler. This is super, super important. And you're also going to need your other ruler here, the cute cuts, because what we're going to be doing is we're going to use the 10.5 inch to make sure for squaring up the bottom, and this is going up on the top. Okay, so now I've cut off this corner. I have my 190-degree corner, my bottom right hand, and then I've gone up the top, so you can see that. So then I'm going to move my quilt further up this beautiful mat, and then I'm going to continue doing that. Now, when you are squaring up a quilt, I've talked about the measuring the width. You measure the width from the bottom, the width in the middle, and the width on the top. And when that is measured, then you want to make sure that this has the same width throughout the whole quilt. Now, generally speaking, you do that squaring up before you do the quilting, because otherwise your quilt is going to be very challenging to when you're doing your free motion quilting, because it's not square. So one side of the quilt is going to be a little bit over. You're going to have maybe some ruffles, or not ruffles, but you're going to have some fullness in your quilt, which makes it very difficult, because if the backing is all nice and the same size, and you put you put the top on, it's not like it's going to conform to the back. It's just going to be its own. So if the top is 50 inches on the bottom and 51 at the top, you're going to have a whole extra inch on the top that's not going to be square. And so it just causes problems. And so, okay, so now my quilt is all trimmed up, and now I get to make the decision of what kind of binding would be the best choice for my quilt. Now, as you can see, this quilt has lots of amazing colors, and Dina did a great job at developing prints that truly complement the quilt. So here we have larger print. There's a smaller print version of that. There's the basketballs. I love the basketball texture one. And then the green and white, which is a great blender. And then this yellow has kind of like a scoreboard. I tend to go with a darker frame just because I feel like it's very traditional, and so I could definitely go with this orange that's like a basketball. But I kind of like the idea of going with the smaller print just because I feel like this is all a lot of text, and so having this text to go along with it is pretty neat. The only thing you do have to worry about is the directionality of it, and also when you're making a binding, you're just going to see just like this much of it. So I don't know how much of the text you're actually going to see, but as far as the design element of it, you have a lot. Like the whole quilt is vintage t-shirt inspiration with lots of text. So you definitely could go with the text. I wouldn't go with something like this because it is such a big scale. And when you are looking at the binding, and I'll be explaining it, when you cut the binding, it's 2.5 inches, and then you press it in half, and then you apply it to the one side of the quilt, and then you fold it over again. So you really are not seeing much of that. So this one, probably not so much. I do like the idea of the text. Mostly, the other reason I like it is because it really is a great blender of all the colors, so it ties it in. These basketball hoops could also be a lot of fun. There are several places on the quilt where there's orange on the outside, and so I think these basketballs would be fun, except for the fact that it has a lot of white on it, and quilts get, well, you want them to be used and abused, so it could get a little bit more dirty. I love this one. I love the orange. I love the texture of the basketball. It's super fun. And as you don't have to worry about orange not matching with the other colors on the quilt because they're designed to all really work well together. So, and then the green. If you love green and if you want to highlight that, I think the green would look fantastic. I love those colors together. I think that's such a great combination. So that's a good option. The yellow is actually not so bad. At first I thought maybe not, but then again, yellow is very similar. It's very light color, and so depending on who you're giving it to for washing care. So I'm going to use the yellow, the small print, or the basketball texture. What would you choose? Everyone, I've chosen the orange basketball texture. I just couldn't help myself. I just know it's such a unique print, and it's just so, it's such a cool graphic. So I'm going to go with the classic. And so what I'm doing now is I'll remove the quilt from my cutting table. And so when I'm cutting my binding, I need 2.5-inch strips. Now, if my fabric is super wrinkly, I will go and press it before I work with it, because if it is wrinkled and it's not working well, I can take the risk of having inaccurate cutting, and we don't want to do that. So when we're quilting, we want to take good best practices and have that nicely pressed. So now that it's all pressed and ready to go, what I always do when I get my fabric, even if it's been cut before, like this one is, like I never used this fabric. So I always trim off the existing edge. And the reason I do that is so that I know that I'm gonna have accuracy with my cutting. So I have this little tiny strip, which I think is worth taking off, and so now you have a nice fresh cut. The other thing that happens is when you fold your fabric like I am, you want the bottom and the top fabric to be the same. So when you do it this way, you're working on the same framework. Now, I didn't even take my ruler off. I'm sliding my ruler over, And so I'm lining up my 2.5 inch right from the edge that I trimmed. So when I do that now, I'm going to 2.5, 2.5 comes all the way down. I follow along, and then I'm going to trim off my 2.5. Now, when you're using your yardage, you don't ever use the selvage edge. And we've talked a lot about the selvage edge. Oops. Okay. So I've got my one finger on the mat and I've got my hand on the cutter. Now I'm just going to see if I got it all cut. Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to put all of my strips in a pile because afterwards I'm going to cut the selvage edge off at the same time. So I'm going to cut up all my strips. Now, you might be wondering, how do you know how much binding to cut? If you don't know how much binding to cut and you're not, for example, you have this panel. So when you buy the panel and it's at the store and you just want to quilt that, you need to know how much binding. So what you do is you measure the length. So when you add the perimeter of your quilt, you add 10 inches and that will give you enough fabric for your binding. Okay, so now we're back at the sewing machine. I've got my binding strips all trimmed, cut and trimmed. So I remember when I first learned how to make binding the proper way, it was like a revelation. It was amazing. But it's kind of, I'm not necessarily a mathematical mind person. And so when I first figured this out, it was kind of tricky, and I still have to manipulate it so that I get it. So what you're going to do is you put your 2.5 inch binding strips together this way. So in a 90 degree, 45 degree. No, 90 degrees. But you're going to sew them on the 45. Okay, so you put them here, one on top of another, so you have like a 90 degree angle. One's going across, one's vertical, one's horizontal. You're going to join them together, and then what you're going to do is you're going to sew them down at a 45. But the 45 actually starts over here in this corner and goes down to this corner, because when it's sewn, it's going to be then straightened. So I still always have to think of that. So I have my, and you want to keep your fabric you're working with on the table. So you bring your needle down, you keep that up. If it helps you to pin it, you can go right ahead. I've done this so much that I don't necessarily need the pinning. And then you're going to just come across. Now, this is really important. This is your end. So the end now goes on this side of your sewing table. Now this is your new part. So you get your next strip and you do the exact same thing. You want the good sides together. One is horizontal, the other one is vertical. And then you're going to start up here in the top left corner. And if you're not sure about it, you just hold your finger and then you flip your fabric. Oh yeah, that's going to make it a nice straight. So you just line these up. And you're just going to sew on the 45 and the corner to corner. Even if it helps you to draw a line so you can see where the bottom one is, that's totally fine. You can draw with a Frixion pen or anything that shows you. So now this is going to be a loop because we're just doing chain piecing. So now I have my new end of my binding strip. So I'm going to have good sides together, come across, line them up once again, and I'm just going to keep going. So I'm going to sew all my pieces together. And again, I know these are going to be loose because I've sewn them closed. So you just keep going until they're all sewn. Okay, so to trim our binding, you just take I take this shortcut, this mini, and then I line up the seam with a 1/4 inch seam, and then I just trim. And then I can cut off the rest of my, because right now they're all joined, and then I can just cut them off, and then it'll just be one really long binding strip. Okay, so now that I have all of my strips sewn and attached, so you can just follow along and you'll see where one joins the other. So you have this beautiful join here, and so now the next step is we're going to take this over to the ironing board, and we're going to press all of our seams. A lot of people recommend you pressing your seams open here, and the reason why we press our seams open is that we are going to be folding this over and then attaching it to one side, and then it's going to be folded over again. So if you have two seams together, it's going to be very bulky over such a small space. So I recommend you pressing these seams open, and then we're going to be pressing our binding in half this way. Okay? The binding, I was able to press it all and wind it on this super adorable binding baby. This is so adorable. This is the newest of the line, Binding Baby. This is Mia. And Sherry Butler of Doohickey Designs has made these. And so she has donated one for a giveaway in our Learn to Quilt charity quilt along. So that's really exciting. So what the beauty of this binding baby is that you put it through the slot, and then you can put it up here on your sewing machine on this needle where you put your thread, and then it can stay on your machine, and as you're binding, it'll come off. So it's super handy. Okay, so here's my quilt on the table, and I actually put my binding on the back side first. And so I place my binding, this is the tail end, and I'm going to start sewing along here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam, and as I'm sewing, I'm making sure that these are lined up on top of each other. And so then we come all the way to the corner, and when we get to the corner, so I'm just going to bring Maya around here, so cute. So we just bring this binding along, and then when we come right to the end, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop a 1/4 inch from the end. Just move her. And then I'm going to do a 45-degree angle, and I'm going to sew off my quilt. So again, I come along here, 1/4 inch, and then a 1/4 inch away from the end, I'm going to stop my needle, so in this very corner, and then I'm going to sew off this mitered edge. Okay, so I have my quilt here on my machine, and you see here I've lined it up, my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I always leave at least 8 inches or so of my binding in the tail, and I generally start my binding on the bottom right hand corner of my quilt. I just do that out of consistency. So I'm going to sew this down until I get to the corner. Okay, I'm approaching my corner here. And so if I'm not quite sure where my 1/4 inch is, I have this super handy little measuring tape from Clover, I Sew for Fun. And I can just measure with my the 1/4 inch on here, and then I can indicate it on my machine. If I want to mark it with a pin, then I can. So I'm going to come up to the end here, and then I'm going to pivot my foot at the 1/4 inch seam, and then I'm going to sew off at a 45-degree angle. So I'll put my presser foot back down, and then I'm going to sew off of this. Okay, so I've indicated, so I have my 45, And then I'm going to fold this up at a 45-degree angle. And then I'm going to bring this seam, this binding down. And then when I have it nice and square, then I can start sewing again at that 1/4 inch, and I can keep coming down. Okay, so just once again, I want to recap where we're at. So I started my binding. Here I leave a tail. I come down into this corner. At a 1/4 inch, I come over on a 45-degree angle. I fold it over and then flip it up, and then I bring it down. And now I'm going to continue to sew my binding. I've got my binding baby, little Mia here. And so my binding is wrapped up on this adorable spool, and then it comes down off of my machine. And I'm going to continue sewing on the binding on the back side of my quilt, and I'm sewing at a 1/4 inch seam. And I'm going to continue to do this for the entire quilt until I come back to about here, and I'm going to have this opening. So probably leave it about 10 inches or so open. Okay, so I have all my binding attached around my quilt. This is so exciting. We're almost there. And so what I do is I leave these flaps open. And so, because I want to have this space so that I have space to, this room to work. So you'll see how I fold the quilt over. Now, this is the easiest method. There are other methods that can allow you to have a 45, but this one is super simple. So what you're going to do is you just line up your binding where they will meet. And so I just fold it in half, and I use these clover pins to fold over. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to just cut below, just the flat part below each one of those. Now I've finger pressed this seam, and then I can then sew these seams together. Okay, so I've put these two seams together now, and now I'm just going to sew a 1/4 inch seam in between, sew these together. And so that's, you see how when I go to sew, I need to adjust my quilt here. And so then I will have space to sew my seam, and then when I open it up, it'll just work out perfect. Okay, so I've sewn these seams together, and I've pressed them open, and then I folded them in half. And so now, there we go, fold it over. And look at that, it just works out so perfectly. And so now we can just sew along our 1/4 inch seam, and then our quilt will be put onto the back. And you won't believe how much easier, that was the hard part. And so now we're going to the fun, easy part, and our quilt is almost done. Okay, so our binding is now attached to the back of our quilt. And so what we're going to do now is we're just going to flip this binding over, and we are going to attach it onto the front. Now, one thing that works super for me is if I press my binding flat. Now I've used a soft backing, and so this is a polyester base. This is Fireside. So I am not going to press directly on the Fireside. Actually, what I'm going to do on the ironing board is I will have my cotton side up, and I will press this part over. And so what that does is the heat will go through this part, and with the back of my hand, I'll just make sure this is nice and flat, and then I'll press this over. And then I'm going to take these amazing Wonder Clips. I love these. These are the mini Wonder Clips, and so they are very precise. I love the way that they work. And so when I'm pressing, so I take my Wonder Clips to the ironing board, and then as I'm pressing, I will put my Wonder Clip every 3 or 4 inches. So once that's done, then when I come to the sewing machine, I'll be super ready to go, and I won't have to worry about that not going smoothly. So my next step now is to go to the ironing board. I'm going to press this flat and over. Now the thing that you have to keep in mind is the reason we put a binding on in the first place is to cover up this raw edge. And so we want to make sure that when we're sewing it, it's going to be nice and equal. And so we want to make sure that we have the same distance of our binding. And we also don't want our binding to be loose. So we really want it to be nice and snug to the seam. So right here, my finger, I can feel that nice firm seam. So as you're using the Wonder Clips, make sure that you're attaching them so that you're able to get that same distance of where you're going to be sewing. And it'll just make it so much nicer for a finish. Okay, so now my binding clips, everything is pressed and my binding clips are on. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sew down, down right here on the edge. And so I'm going to just bring it all the way around. Now I just want to point out, look how beautiful that the point is. So when we do the mitered corner like this, it's really important to keep it nice and crisp in that fold. Okay, so that's really, really important. So I show how to do this. So I come up and I bring it that 45 degree and then I fold it over. So then when I'm sewing, if I need to, I can actually just use a pin to kind of anchor it as I'm coming to it. Okay, so now we've finished putting our binding on. One of the reasons I love to do the binding, put it on the back and then bring it forward, is that you have that much more control of where the stitching is going. So I actually only started doing this about a year ago. And I would have to check the backing, and because I do like the look of the binding on the front when it's folded over, but having it stitched along here, you can see exactly where you're stitching, and so it's really consistent. So you can experiment both ways. Another thing that happens is when people are doing binding, they will put they'll hand stitch the binding. And so then they can do like a slip stitch, and that's definitely fine, and it's actually quite therapeutic. But I find, especially when I'm making charity quilts or quilts for younger people, there's a lot of wash and wear, and so to have machine stitch binding is just that much more stable, and I think it's going to wear a lot better. So that is how I do it. Now, the last thing we need to do to finish off our quilt is to put on a label. Now, I admit I am very guilty of not doing this very often, and so it's something that I'm working on. And so in order to do so, I actually have purchased pre-made labels. So this is a kit from Modern Yardage, and I can add the links into my website on my I'll add the link. So they're really cute. Things like a friend is worth 1,000 stitches and you deserve every single one, made with loving hands and very sore fingers. Made with love, made for you, stitched especially. This one kills me. This is my favorite. This took me forever. You're welcome. Made with love by. So those are super cute. So you can buy labels like that. Another one that I bought a meter of. These ones are, this is Sweetwater. They mother and daughter team, and so they're little labels. And so what I've done is cut them out. So obviously I'm just working around. I will reinforce them. Quite often I'll put felt on the back. So I'll cut out the shape and then I will put felt on it, and then I'll stitch it onto my quilt, and I can just hand stitch it on there. And I just use a permanent marker, and that seems to work really well. So those are labels. Some people use embroidery, and so they will get them custom made, and that's also quite lovely. What I did in this quilt is I used my love for free motion quilting to do my label. And so in the bottom corner, I stitched Steve. I stitched thanks Steve, and then I put my son's name. I tried to get him to do it on the long arm, but it's not so easy always to use the free motion quilting. So we have it right here, and so every time that he goes to have this blanket, it's a sweet reminder that we appreciated all that he did for us. And so that's a really wonderful way to show his love. Now, one of the things that happens when you are quilting for charity, it's that debate I know that I've had is, do I give it just because I want to give it, or do I want thanks back? I will reinforce them. Quite often I'll put felt on the back. So I'll cut out the shape, and then I will put felt on it, and then I'll stitch it onto my quilt, and I can just hand stitch it on there. And I just use a permanent marker, and that seems to work really well. So those are labels. Some people use embroidery, and so they will get them custom made, and that's also quite lovely. What I did in this quilt is I used my love for free motion quilting to do my label. And so in the bottom corner, I stitched thanks Steve, and then I put my son's name. I tried to get him to do it on the long arm, but it's not so easy always to use the free motion quilting. So we have it right here, and so every time that he goes to have this blanket, it's a sweet reminder that we appreciated all that he did for us. And so that's a really wonderful way to show his love. Now, one of the things that happens when you are quilting for charity, it's that debate I know that I've had is, do I give it just because I want to give it, or do I want thanks back? And so many times, most of the time when I make quilts for charity, I don't put my name. I don't do that because I feel like it's just it's really fun for me just to make them and know that one little boy or girl or teenager, whoever it is, receives that quilt.